Hi, my name is Danni Quintos, and I am a poet and writer. And today we are going to look at a couple poems and write some poems and talk about poetry a little bit. So, in the last video that I made for you all, we talked about detail. So, I'm just going to review some of the things that we talked about as a little refresher because details are so important when it comes to poetry. Details, the best advice for any writer is to add specific, concrete, and luminous details. Be observant, look for the unusual, the strange, the stuff that sticks to your memory. That's what makes good writing, is really specific details. When you describe something and someone is able to imagine what it looks like or what it feels like, what it smells like, what it tastes like, then that means that you've done something well. You've written something that's vivid and that it communicates an image in a way that kind of plants a picture or a thought, an idea in someone's head. So we talked about persona poems last time, and I had you all write a couple persona poems from the prompts. And a persona poem is a poem in the voice of someone other than the poet. This could be a person, an animal, an inanimate object, or an abstract concept. And you might think of a persona as a character. Imagine what your toothbrush might say if it could talk. Maybe your favorite stuffed animal from childhood, maybe a character from your favorite book, or an historical figure. So those are ways to think about some ideas for a persona poem, different ideas for writing in a persona. If you wrote a poem in the voice of any of those different characters, people, animals, inanimate objects, then it would be a persona poem because it's not in the voice of you, the writer. So today we're going to talk about epistolary poems. Epistolary is a fancy way of saying in the form of a letter. So I've got this little paper plane. I'm sure that you all don't pass notes in class, but when I was a kid, we would write notes on pieces of paper and fold them into little shapes, triangles and squares, and we would pass them to each other. Never a paper plane, though. A poem, an epistolary poem, is a poem in the form of a letter. It's addressed to someone. It's in letter form. Epistles or epistolary poems are usually written as an address in second person. This means that the poem is speaking directly to someone using the word you. That's second person. We will look at some examples. One epistolary poem is written with found language from a bunch of letters that the poet received, and one as a response to a quote. So let's have a look. Epistolary poems, aka poems in letter form. So I've chosen two poems by the poet Amy Nezuko-Matatil. She has a very long last name, and one of these poems kind of addresses her last name. So this first poem is called Dear Betty Brown. And there is an epigraph at the top, which is a quote from the U.S. Representative Betty Brown, who is a representative in Texas. And the quote says, "Rather than everyone here having to learn a rather difficult language, do you think that it would behoove you to adopt a name that we could deal with more readily here?" So this quote is asking for people who don't have simple Anglo-sounding last names that are easy to pronounce and read to change their names to something that's easier. And Amy Nezuko-Matatil, who has a very long, complicated last name, has responded to Betty Brown in this epistolary poem. So this poem is called Dear Betty Brown. "If I didn't change my name for my husband, I'm certainly not going to change it for you. You can take the time and learn it like everyone else. I know 5-year-olds who can say it without a stutter or hiccup. They ring the bell. If I were to change it to Brown or White or Black or Jones or Williams or Stevens, I might as well draw a big fat X across my brown face. Or, if you prefer, I could snip the American flag into fringy strips with pinking shears, but that would make the bobbin of the sewing machine that created the flag unspool whole thready puddles into the Great Lakes just in time for the ice boom. And that pop of lake thaw into a fragrance of daffodil and lily would blanket all the neat suburban rows of ranch house after ranch house. It would mean jamming my hand into a bucket of mulberries with my Kansan husband to signal summer, and the slow scrape of leaves across our lawn to signal fall. It means my mother and father each gave me their names from the coconut shores of their countries and created a girl who grew up listening to Elvis while she did her homework and now writes poems about people who should know better. And that, Betty Brown, that is as American as brown Betty cooling on a windowsill, as American as apple pie. So I really love this poem. I think that it's such a smart response to someone saying that you need to change something about the way you are, particularly when it's something that represents your family and your heritage. I think that that is kind of an erasure of your culture and your identity. And the way that Amy Nezuko Matatil responds to this quote is so sharp and biting and brilliant and beautiful. And she's got so much beautiful detail and imagery in this poem. You can kind of hear the sharpness of her voice, particularly when she says, people who should know better, right? And then she kind of points at Betty Brown. So that's one example of an epistolary poem. It's a letter to Betty Brown. Let's look at another example by Amy Nezuko Matatil. So this one is called Dear Amy Nezu Camia Tutil. And this is a found poem composed entirely of emails from various high school students. A found poem is a poem that you don't make the words up yourself. You might compose it from language that you find elsewhere. So in this case, it seems like a bunch of high school students were assigned to read Amy Nezuko Matatil's poetry, and they were all assigned to write her a letter in response to her poetry. And so this poem is a combination of a lot of different lines from different high school students. And I'm going to hide my face to read this poem. Dear Amy Nezuko Matatil, a found poem composed entirely of emails from various high school students. If I were to ask you a question about your book and sum it up into one word, it would be why. I think I like Walt Whitman better than you. I just don't get literature. But for a fast hour-and-a-half read, your book takes the cake. I like how you organize the lines in that one poem to represent a growing, twisting bonsai tree. Are you going to get a rude reaction when you meet that one guy in that one poem? I guess you never know. You are very young to be a poet. I also like how your poem takes up the entire page. It makes our reading assignment go faster. In class, we spend so much time dissecting your poems and then deeply analyzing them. I think I like Walt Whitman better than you. But don't take offense. You are very good too. You are young. You are young and pure and really just want to have a good time. Thank you. We have taken a debate, and you are far better poet than Walt Whitman. And I loved how your poems were easy to read and understand. Hello, my name is Alicia. We read your book and I just loved it. We also read Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. There was no competition there. I liked your book a whole lot better. It was an easy read, but poetry is not my favorite type of literature. Sometimes I am offered drinks and guys try to talk to me, but I too just brush it off and keep dancing. Every once in a while, the creepy mean guys try to offer you a thing and then say something. What would you do? Lastly, I was wondering if you ever wrote a poem that really didn't have a deeper meaning, but everyone still tried to give it one anyways. Walt Whitman is better than you. So this poem, this epistolary poem, is also kind of funny. I think that Amy Nezuko Matatil is kind of a funny poet and lighthearted. She is composing this poem from responses to her own poetry and kind of making it its own letter to her, right? And in ways, it's highlighting the different assignments that the students have. So obviously, they had to read Walt Whitman's *Leaves of Grass*, and they had to read of one of Amy Nezuko Matatil's books, and then compare the two. Talk about which one they liked better, and talk about the individual poems in the books as well. So this poem is a found poem, and it's also an epistolary poem. Okay, so I'm going to have you all write your own epistolary poems, and I've got a few options for you. So if you would grab your paper, pen, whatever it is you use to write with, and I will give you the prompt. So you have a few options for this epistle or epistolary poem, but you should be writing this poem in letter form. So option number 1, and let me make this a little bit bigger. Option number 1 is to write a poem in letter form as a letter to your future self in 10 years or in 20 years. This, you can pick a time. It might be yourself in 10 years or 20 years, however you want to do it. So this is a letter to yourself. What would you say to yourself? What kind of advice would you give? What do you want your older self to know from yourself now? What kind of things do you want to remember that are important to you now that you want the more grown-up version of yourself to know? Another option for this epistolary poem prompt is write a letter that you would never send. So sometimes this is just helpful in kind of getting something off your chest. You're not going to send this letter. So this might be things that you might say to somebody that you would never want them to know, but it might just feel good to say them. Another option, a letter to a public figure in response to something that they said. So if there are public figures that interest you, you might think about things that they have said recently. For example, you could think about lyrics from a song if there is an artist that you like, and you might respond to song lyrics of someone's, or you might respond to like Amy Nezuko Matatil does. She responds to something a representative says. So you might respond to something that someone in power, a politician, for example, might have said. So that would be inspired by Amy Nezuko Matatil's poem, Dear Betty Brown, right? If you can think of something that someone has said that is in power, that's kind of famous, right? You could respond to that. And then the fourth option would be a letter full of questions for a relative you never met. So there might be a grandparent or an aunt or a relative who you never got to meet, but you've heard a lot about. So this last prompt is asking you to write a letter to that person, and those questions can be about maybe your parents' childhood or your the way that they met their partner or spouse, or what school was like for them, what kind of food did they eat, what was their favorite game growing up, what was their childhood like. So you've got 4 options: a letter to your future self, a letter you would never send, a letter to a public figure in response to something that they said, and a letter full of questions for a relative you never met. So I will give you all a few minutes time, maybe write for about 7 minutes, choosing one of these epistolary prompts. Okay, so for this second prompt, I'm going to be asking you to write another epistolary poem, another letter, and you have 3 options. So these are letters that aren't necessarily to people, or at least real people, okay? So your first option is to write a letter to a force of nature. This, for example, this could be a thunderstorm, an earthquake, a volcano, a forest fire, an illness. And I'd say a force of nature, because forces of nature are powerful. They have they're something out of your control. And so it's more likely that you would have strong feelings about a force of nature, right? You can also write about just something in nature if you want to, a tree, a mountain, a cave. But I think that a force of nature is going to be a better option, because forces of nature, as I said, you're more likely to feel strongly about them. So you might start your letter, dear forest fires in California, right? Dear volcano eruption in Pompeii, right? So that's an example of one of your options to a force of nature. Another thing that you can write a letter to, another option, is an inanimate object that you see or use every day. For example, this can be a vehicle, like this little bug down here we see at the bottom. It can be your computer. I know that a lot of you all are probably doing a lot of your school online. You might have strong feelings about your computer. An alarm clock. Sometimes I have strong feelings about my alarm clock when I don't want to wake up early in the morning. A library book that you really love. You don't want to let it go. You don't want it to go back to the library, or you might have other strong feelings about a book. Your bed, your home, your favorite toy. Choose something that you feel strongly about, because then you'll have more to write about in your letter. And then the third option is a fictional character from a book, a movie, a TV show. This can be a human, an animal, any other kind of creature that is not human or animal too will work. But a fictional character that you feel strongly about. And it doesn't have to be a character that you love. It can be a character that you are not a big fan of, that you're disappointed in, or that's always ruining something. One of my son's favorite characters is from Dora the Explorer. Swiper, the fox, is always taking their stuff and trying to throw it and get rid of it, right? Always trying to cause trouble. So choose a fictional character that you feel strongly about. You might really admire a character from a book or a movie or a show that you watch. Or you might, like I said, be really frustrated with a character and want to write a letter to tell them how you feel. So these are your choices. They're choices that are not real people, right? So a force of nature, an inanimate object that you see or use every day, or a fictional character from a book, movie, or TV show. And I'll give you all about 7 minutes to write on this prompt.